My name is Emma, and my parents, who were already in their 40s and had a 10-year-old daughter they believed was more than enough, brought me into the world as an afterthought. My mother used to say, "We didn't plan for you." Not in a mean way, but more as if she were stating the weather. If it wasn't for your grandparents' insistence, the message was clear. I was here because my maternal grandparents persuaded my hesitant parents to have another kid. She would fade off, leaving the rest unsaid. My parents saw me as a burden they hadn't requested, but they were thrilled about the possibility of having a second grandchild. By the time I got there, my sister Sarah was already engrossed in her own adolescent world. She just pretended that I didn't exist. She wasn't harsh or rude. She would be splayed on the couch, talking on the phone about boyfriends and college applications, totally unaware of me, while I played with my dolls in the corner of our shared living room. Mom would put her safe study materials in her backpack and say, "Sarah, honey, don't forget your SAT prep books." I would be waiting for someone to notice that I needed help with my schoolwork while I sat at the kitchen table. However, my parents hardly ever offered assistance. Rather, they established a pattern that influenced my whole upbringing. They would drop me off at my grandparents' place every morning. My father would remark to my grandfather you wanted her, as he got ready to go for work. He's jingling in his palm. "She's all yours." My actual home was my grandparents' house. They made sure I was fed and taken care of, picked me up from school, helped me with my schoolwork, and took me to the park. My parents, who were generally exhausted and a little irritated at having to make the journey, would only arrive to pick me up late at night. My grandmother used to remark, "Emma, when she gave me a final embrace every night, 'You're the best thing that ever happened to us.'" And I could almost forget that I wasn't welcomed anywhere else while I was in her loving hug. Day after day, year after year, this trend persisted. I learned to live as an afterthought in my own house while my sister got ready for her promising future. However, my grandparents' love was unfailing and unchanging. I discovered what it meant to be genuinely appreciated in their household. As we worked on my arithmetic assignment one day, my grandfather said, "You'll understand that sometimes the best things in life aren't planned." For an instant, the burden of being unwelcome was relieved from my tiny shoulders as he gave me a wink. I hoped that things would improve at home now that Sarah was away at college. I was the daughter who stayed, and perhaps my parents would see me at last. I was completely mistaken. My mother called out to me, "Emma," before I had a chance to put my backpack down after school. "The home has to be cleaned. Let's start with the restrooms." I was given a lot of additional duties, in addition to the ones that had previously been Sarah's. I got to know the washing machine's settings and peculiarities by heart, and it became my daily companion. The housekeeping seemed to go on forever. My father would remark, "You live here, you need to contribute," if I hesitated in the least. Your sister always did her part. My career progressed from cleaning to cooking by the time I was 14. The shift wasn't gradual. My mother just quit preparing dinner one day. "You're old enough now," she said one morning. "We expect dinner ready when we get home from work." I prepared spaghetti the first evening. It was acceptable despite being a little overdone. In quiet, my parents ate. My father then raised his head from his plate. He stated, "Tomorrow, try something with chicken," but it was obvious from his tone that this was not a recommendation. Dreaming about college was the only way I could get away. I would go to my room every night after doing the dishes and go through university websites. I would see myself traversing several campuses, distant from the never-ending tasks and chilly quiets. Then when I was 16, Sarah brought home some news that completely altered my life. One Sunday afternoon, she burst in the front door, pulling a tall, smartly dressed guy along with her. She said, "Mom, Dad, This is James. We got engaged. You would believe that someone had just declared their lottery victory. My folks genuinely leaped out of their chairs. My father was already taking out his phone to call family members, while my mother broke down in floods of happiness. "We'll cover everything," my mother said as she gave Sarah a hug. "Our first daughter's wedding has to be perfect." For months, our home was occupied with wedding preparations. Every discussion centered on guest lists, venues, and flowers. Top-tier products, high-end merchants, and designer gowns made money seem to flow like water. Despite attending the wedding, my grandparents didn't appear to like the extravagant decor. I saw my grandma scowling at the ice sculpture, which was likely more expensive than a semester's worth of tuition. At the champagne fountain, grandfather just shook his head, but they didn't share their opinions. 3 college admission letters were laid out in front of me as I sat at our dinner table 2 years later. After playing the role of Cinderella for years and getting straight A's, I was accepted to all of my preferred schools. As I broke the wonderful news to my parents, my heart was pounding. My mother remarked, "That's nice," without raising her gaze from her dish. "We are unable to pay for it, nevertheless. The wedding of your sister consumed all of our savings. Even obtained a loan to pay for it. Nothing remains for college. But you paid for Sarah's college." I stumbled. "That was different," said my mom. "We saw potential in her." There was an eerie hush at the dinner table following my mother's remarks on potential. As my parents proceeded to eat as like they hadn't just crushed my hopes, I sat there with acceptance letters suddenly weighing heavy in my hands. "You should get a job," my father said between bites. "Save up some money. Take out a student loan. That's what responsible adults do." I left the table without being excused, something I'd never dared to do before. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my grandmother. Within minutes, I was walking through their familiar front door, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, sweetheart," my grandmother pulled me into a hug as I told them everything, between sobs. My grandfather's face grew stern as he listened, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. When I finished, they exchanged a knowing look. "Emma," my grandfather said, taking my hand, "we've been expecting something like this." "What do you mean?" "We watched how they've treated you all these years." My grandmother explained how they spent money on Sarah's education, her wedding. "We knew they might do this to you." My grandfather stood up and walked to his study. When he returned, he was holding a folder. "We've been saving for your education since the day you were born," he said, opening the folder to reveal bank statements. "You can choose any of those 3 colleges. We've got you covered." That night, I went home and packed my things. Not everything, just what I needed. My parents were watching TV downstairs and barely looked up when I told them I was moving in with my grandparents. "Whatever you think is best," my mother said, her eyes never leaving the screen. Was that relief I heard in her voice? The next few weeks were a blur of college preparations. I chose to study financial analysis. Somehow, watching my parents' mismanagement of money had sparked an interest in doing things the right way. My grandparents helped me with every detail, from filling out forms to buying supplies. When I finally started classes that fall, it felt like stepping into a new world. The material was challenging, but I loved every minute of it. Each class felt like a step away from my old life and toward something better. My professors noticed my enthusiasm, and soon I was staying after class to discuss complex financial concepts. For the first time in my life, someone besides my grandparents saw potential in me, real potential. My second year of college was in full swing when my grandmother called with some interesting news about Sarah. "Your sister's having trouble," she said during one of our weekly calls. "Her marketing career isn't taking off like she hoped, And James can't seem to hold down a job. They're constantly asking your parents for money. I wasn't surprised when she told me they were getting it. Your mother emptied her retirement account last month to help them with rent. My grandmother sighed. They just can't say no to her. A year later, the situation got worse. Sarah and James couldn't make rent anymore, even with our parents' help. They moved back into my old bedroom, the one I'd spent years keeping spotlessly clean. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, I was thriving. My professors had helped me land internships at prestigious financial firms, where I discovered I had a real talent for solving complex financial puzzles. Each challenging project made me more certain I'd chosen the right path. You've got a natural instinct for this, my supervisor at Morgan Stanley told me during my performance review. We'd love to have you back next summer. I kept my head down and focused on my studies, barely thinking about my family, except during calls with my grandparents. But when I visited them during my senior year, I knew something was wrong the moment I walked through their door. My grandmother's usual warm smile seemed forced, and my grandfather, usually quick with a joke, sat quietly in his armchair. The house felt heavy with unspoken words. "What's wrong?" I asked over dinner, watching them push food around their plates. "And don't tell me it's nothing. I know you both too well." They exchanged a look I'd seen too many times before, the one that meant they were trying to protect me from something. Finally, my grandfather spoke. "Your parents came to see us last week," he said, his voice unusually tired. "They wanted their inheritance early." "What do you mean?" I put down my fork. "They're in trouble with the banks," my grandmother explained. "Multiple loans, credit card debt. They said they needed $200,000 to avoid bankruptcy. And you gave it to them." I couldn't keep the anger from my voice. My grandfather nodded. "We had to, Emma. They're still our daughter and son-in-law, despite everything. It was most of our savings." "But most of your savings?" I was furious. After everything they've done, after how they keep enabling Sarah's irresponsible behavior, after how they treated me, sweetheart. My grandmother reached across the table to take my hand. "We know you're angry, but what's done is done. We'll be fine." But I kept getting angry. My parents, who'd never had money for my education, who treated me like a servant, had the audacity to demand money from the only people who'd ever truly cared for me, all because they couldn't say no to Sarah and couldn't manage their own finances. My hard work paid off after graduation, with glowing recommendations from my professors and impressive internship experiences. I landed a position at one of the top financial firms in the city. The starting salary was more than I'd ever dreamed of making. I found a modest one-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy, but clean and safe. Every morning, I'd wake up grateful that I didn't have to cook breakfast for anyone but myself. My career flourished as I threw myself into each new challenge, earning promotions and bonuses that my younger self couldn't have imagined. Within a few years, I had enough saved for a down payment on my own place. The day I signed the mortgage papers, I couldn't help but think of my parents and Sarah, who'd never managed their money well enough to buy property. Not that they knew about my success. We hadn't spoken in years. Then came the call that changed everything. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone. My grandmother, who'd been by his side for over 50 years, seemed to lose her spark after that. Less than 2 months later, she followed him. I was arranging my grandmother's funeral when I heard a familiar voice behind me at the funeral home. "Emma, do you want some help with the arrangements?" I turned to find my mother standing there, looking older and more tired than I remembered. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave, but something in her expression made me hesitate. Sure, I heard myself say. That would be nice. Over the next few days, as we planned the service, my parents began to open up. They were struggling. They admitted that retirement hadn't been kind to them financially. We barely make ends meet. My father confessed one afternoon while we were picking out flowers. And with Sarah's twins, this was news to me. Yes, 4-year-olds, my mother jumped in. Such beautiful boys, but they need so much. Sarah and James still can't manage on their own, so we help where we can. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Some things never changed. A week after we laid my grandmother to rest, we gathered in a wood-paneled office for the reading of the will. I sat across from my parents with Sarah and James slouched in chairs beside them. The room smelled of old papers and furniture polish, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The notary, Mr. Patterson, adjusted his glasses and began reading in a monotone voice. I expected the usual legal jargon, but what came next made everyone sit up straight. To our beloved granddaughter, Emma, he read. We leave our house at 1542 Maple Street and the sum of $150,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth fell open, and my mother gripped my father's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and continued. And a personal note from Mr. Henderson to his daughter, Margaret. He looked at my mother. The note reads, Margaret, remember that we gave you $200,000 when you needed it most. This is our final decision, and we trust you will respect it as we respected your needs. My mother's face flushed red, then pale. My father stared at the floor while Sarah and James exchanged worried glances. After the notary finished and gathered his papers, my parents approached me in the parking lot. The confident demeanor they'd shown during the funeral arrangements was gone, replaced by something almost desperate. Emma, honey, my mother began, her voice trembling. You have to understand, we always thought we'd inherit the house. We were counting on it. We're struggling. My father added, the mortgage, Sarah's family's expenses. We could really use the house. I looked at them both, remembering all the years of neglect, the constant reminders that I wasn't wanted, the refusal to help with my education. No, I said firmly. The house is mine. That's what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. They continued pleading, following me to my car, but I stood firm. Sarah joined in, talking about how her boys needed a yard to play in, but I simply got in my car and drove away. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother asking me to come over for dinner. Something in her voice sounded different, humbled perhaps. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Pulling up to my childhood home was like stepping back in time, except everything looked shabbier than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the gutter sagged, and the once pristine lawn was patchy and overgrown. Inside, the house was crowded but clean. Sarah's twins, Tommy and Jake, ran circles around the living room while James half-heartedly told them to settle down. The boys were cute. They had Sarah's eyes and James's curly hair. Emma, my mother, smiled, pulling me into an awkward hug. We made your favorite pot roast. That's not my favorite, I said automatically. That's Sarah's favorite. An uncomfortable silence followed, broken by my father clearing his throat. Well, why don't you tell us what your favorite food is? We'd love to know. Surprisingly, they seemed genuinely interested. Over dinner, they asked about my job, my apartment, my hobbies. They actually listened when I talked about my work in finance, though I could tell most of it went over their heads. That dinner led to another, then another. Soon I was joining them for holidays, bringing gifts for the twins, even helping Sarah with their homework. Sometimes, when they mentioned the house needed repairs, I found myself offering to help. I paid for a new roof, fixed the heating system, repainted the exterior. Each time I wrote a check, my parents would tear up with gratitude. "You're too good to us," my mother would say, hugging me. "We don't deserve this." "You're right," I would think, but never say it aloud. Because despite everything, despite all the years of hurt and neglect, some small part of me still wanted to believe people could change. The years passed, and my career continued to flourish. Each promotion brought new opportunities, and my investment portfolio grew substantially. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents seemed to strengthen. They were getting older, both were over 70 now, and I found myself wanting to do something meaningful for them. "I've been thinking," I said during one of our Sunday dinners, watching my father struggle up from his chair. "This house isn't really suitable for you anymore. I want to buy you a new house, something single-story with a nice garden, but easier to maintain. Something that would be comfortable for your retirement years." Their reaction surprised me. Actual tears of joy. We spent the next few weeks house hunting together and finally found the perfect place. A beautiful ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood with wide doorways and no stairs. After closing my checkbook, my parents couldn't stop talking about how excited they were. "We meet to have a proper housewarming party," my father declared. "Let us arrange everything. It's the least we can do." That would be lovely, I agreed, planning to present them with the deed during the celebration. "Just let me know when." Weeks passed. I was busy with work, but kept expecting an invitation. When nothing came, I started asking about the date. "Oh, we're still planning," my mother would say. "You know how these things take time." "We want it to be perfect," my father would add. "We'll let you know soon." Something about their vague responses niggled at me. One evening, after another deflecting phone call from my mother, I found myself typing Sarah's name into Facebook. I hadn't looked at her profile in years. We weren't connected on any social media. There it was, posted just hours ago. "So excited for Mom and Dad's housewarming party this Saturday. The house is gorgeous. Can't wait to celebrate with everyone." The post had dozens of comments from relatives and friends, all confirming their attendance. Photos showed decorations being set up, caterers being booked. This wasn't a last-minute gathering. This had been planned for weeks. My hand shaking slightly, I called my mother. "Hi, Mom," I kept my voice casual. "Just checking in about the housewarming party. Have you set a date yet?" "Oh, honey, not yet," she replied smoothly. "Probably in a couple of weeks. We're still working out the details. We want everyone to be able to come." Everyone except me, apparently. That Saturday, I parked my car a block away from the house. Music and laughter drifted through the evening air. Through the large front windows, I could see dozens of people milling about. Relatives I recognized, friends of my parents, Sarah's social circle. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. They were expecting everyone except the person who actually owned the house. I slipped in quietly, following the sound of my father's voice to the living room. And after all these years of hard work, we finally did it. He was saying to a group of attentive listeners, "Bought our dream home." "Don't forget about Sarah," my mother added proudly. "She helped so much with the down payment. Such a wonderful daughter, always taking care of her parents." Someone commented, "Unlike some people." My mother said pointedly, "You know, our younger daughter hasn't helped us at all. Probably too busy with her career to care about family." I stood in the doorway, heat rising to my face as I watched this performance. Sarah beamed beside them, her 7-year-old twins running between the guests in the house I bought. "Actually," I said loudly, making everyone jump, "I think you've got that backwards." The color drained from my parents' faces. Guests turned to stare at me, whispers rippling through the crowd. My father recovered first, his smile tight. What a surprise. I said, "I'm sure it is," and entered the room. Especially since you forgot to invite me to the housewarming party for the house I bought. There was a dead quiet in the room. Suddenly, Sarah's husband showed a strong interest in his shoes. My mother's tone was sharp when she said, "Well, what's done is done. Yes, you purchased it, but it is now ours. You cannot expect to be grateful forever." "That's right," my dad said, growing more certain. "You're not welcome here, to be honest. Sarah and her family will also be residing here, so this is a family get-together." My mother declared, "They've already sold their house. It's all arranged." I couldn't resist laughing, a loud, icy sound that caused a few of the visitors to back off. I reached inside my backpack and took out a folder. I remarked, "You seem to be confused about something," as I opened the folder to show the ownership and deed documents. "This house is mine. I didn't sign it for you. Tonight, at what I hoped would be a formal housewarming celebration, I was going to deliver it to you." The color of my mother's face changed from pale to ashen. My dad began to splutter. "And now," I said, turning to face the astonished visitors, "I want everyone to go. The party is finished, and here is my house." When my mother said, "You can't do this," her voice became a screech. "Your parents are us." She said, "No," I muttered. "The only ones who gave birth to me are you." I learned that family is more than just blood from my grandparents, who are my true parents. I also learned about money from them, which is why I possess this property while you don't. My parents, Sarah, James, the twins, and all of their guests departed in tears. From the front porch, I observed them driving away one by one until the street was deserted. A few weeks later, I found out that they had purchased an apartment using the proceeds from the sale of their own home. James, the twins, and Sarah moved in with them. For weeks, they attempted to contact me, but I banned their social media accounts, emails, and phone numbers. The home. A month later, I sold it and deposited the proceeds into my account. I made a self-promise that when I have kids of my own someday, they won't ever need to win my affection or vie for my attention. In contrast to my parents, I will love my kids just as much and without conditions, just like my grandparents loved me.